Great stuff. And now we're getting to our first fireside chat. And yeah, I've had some very interesting conversations with Dane Richard in the past over the last, I don't know, Dane, 5, 6, 7 years, odd, maybe even 10 years. But Dane is the CEO of JMR Software. We're going to talk a little bit, Graham, Dane, a fascinating discussion, because this sort of ties up with what we've just spoken about here, is that, who's guarding the guardians, as they used to say, as AI starts making decisions and starts doing things on our behalf, etc. How do we hold those algorithmic decisions to the same ethical and operational standards as humans? Yeah, Dane has given it some thought, and I would love to hear how you think we can do this, Dane. Thank you very much for your time and welcome.
Yeah, morning, Tony, and to everyone on the call. I think, yeah, it's a fascinating question, I think, because if I think back to the opening keynote, I think Graham touched on it very explicitly. You have a lot of organizations now that had no AI influence a year ago. Now it's become a very key topic, I think, in this day and age, and you're finding a lot more organizations and company now having to, I guess, navigate the minefield of how does AI fit into the real world, the real implementation aspects of it. And I think specifically when we're talking insurance platforms, and us as JMR as a platform provided, it raises a very philosophical question, in the sense that policy administration, it involves critical decisions, and from underwriting to amendments to renewals to terminations, when you bring AI systems onto these roles that were once filled by humans, the question then is, do we need to hold them to the same level of auditing, documentation, and compliance standards? And like I said, it's a bit of a gray area slash philosophical question. Maybe gray area is not the right word, but it comes with a lot of pros and cons. And if we digest to me, let me break it down into why I think it should and why one shouldn't potentially hold it to the same level of accountability. So on the pro side, there's a concept called accountability parity. So when you come to customer outcomes, a good platform and a good organization, it must be traceable, regardless of whatever decision was made. Equal accountability equals auditability, equal auditability in this game of things. You, as a platform provider and organization, you must hold your product to account. How has a critical decision being made, and can you build it back to why that decision was made? The other side is the regulatory aspect. This is a upcoming one, but now as the world starts bringing AI into the play, obviously government and that follows suit, and there's a lot of regulatory and legislation acting coming out, and particularly in the EU. The EU now has a new act called the EU AI Act, and there, specifically with insurance, they classify AI and insurance underwriting as very high risk. What does that mean? Well, then it's your implementation of AI is held to a very rigorous level of control. Do you have documentation and oversight over how you've brought AI into your decision making from a product tool? And then the third one is bias and fairness risks. Is as a tool, there's countless stories on X, or the formerly Twitter, where they have their Grok model tool, and they implement it, and as it goes on and it starts interacting, the model starts shifting. So it forms a bias to one particular area, and eventually the XAI need to get involved and start tweaking your model to change the bias aspect of that particular model. When it comes to insurance, it's one thing to have a chatbot, but if your product is starting to bias towards, making discriminations against age, gender, location, etc., that becomes problematic for your tool. Um, the other side of that, the last one really is just control requirements as an organization. If your platform is subscribed to a lot of international standards like ISO or SOC 2, there the basis is you must be able to track your change model against your product. So if you release a new version, you've updated the AI model, what evidence do you have that now you've now changed the way your product then rates or reviews information from your customers? So I think those are the key topics about why one should regulate, or not regulate, I think is the wrong word, but hold it to the same standards as you would your human interactions with your platform. And then just to touch quickly on why I think it shouldn't is there's that the AI decisions are fundamentally different, right? So AI works on statistical inference. There's a lot of high-level maths that's way beyond my pay grade that goes into AI models, and you can see in the industry there's a lot of new careers coming out that are highly paid because it's a highly specialized area of statistical inference from a math point. As humans, we don't work on statistical decision making. It's more an inference model. Your best decisions in underwriting are based on experience, etc. And so you can't hold an AI to the same level of scrutiny because it's a different decision chain of events that the tool will trigger. Um, the same thing is explainability trace-off. If you had to hold a human, and let me use a good example of this, if there was an underwriting decision, your human counterpart that did the assessment of this based off a number of clearly understood checkpoints. You looked at this data, I then made this decision X, Y, Z. When it comes to high performing AI models, it's for example, deep learning, they're inherently hard to interpret. You're effectively relying on the AI to make the decision and build on it itself. So the explainability becomes hard to then, if you need a audit trail or a history of why a decision was made, it's hard to boil that out to, what we as humans experience as auditability because it's hard to define. And then I think the last one is essentially humans aren't always transparent either. So if we look at human decision making within a policy administration platform or within insurances, humans inherently may have a biased outcome. How can you guarantee that a decision that a human has made in terms of a claims assessment was fundamentally fair? In some ways, if you have a well-trained model, the situation exists that you may have a more fair assessment of a claim from an AI model than your human counterpart would do, just in the sense that you don't have those human biases that are hard to track, and they're certainly not recorded within the platform or within that because it's stored within the human itself. So yeah, I think the topic in itself, it's there's pros and cons to it, but when it comes to holding it accountable, well, you have to balance the pros versus the cons.
Yeah, I think absolutely. Just wanted to, I mean, from a sort of a devil's advocate perspective, honestly, if you want to try and get, sort of avoid bias in your AI system, somebody has to decide what is bias. What are those limits of bias? And that in itself is some sort of way of teaching the AI to be biased so that it can be unbiased.
It's a very true statement. And in some ways, when it comes to underwriting specifically, the whole product is biased by principle. If you're making a decision for a premium based on someone's smoker or non-smoker status, the argument exists. You're biasing your price based on a particular condition of an individual. So I think in some ways it's bias is certainly valid when it comes to rating, etc., but it's knowing the correct conditions. So again, I'm going to jump to the underwriting model. A good example of a correct implementation is where it takes the criteria you're using to underwrite your policies into consideration. But if the AI tool starts introducing other other criteria or balances against it that aren't necessarily within your model, then you need to have visibility of that, tracing what decisions have been brought into this in order to determine the outcome.
Yeah. I think we've had that in the past where these underwriting methods were questioned, where we differentiated between young drivers and old ones, female drivers and male drivers, etc. And the end sort of criteria was if you can statistically substantiate your bias, then it's an acceptable bias.
Yes.
Mm.
Yeah,
And
and I think there to touch on it is I think essentially in most cases the only bearing insurers and us as policy administrator platform providers have in this instance is you can rely on the model to make these decisions, but you must have some form of oversight in order to say if it deviates from, and a good example of this is bias testing. So within the software organization, you could have test cases with various scenarios, and as you're then releasing new versions of your platform or just ongoing is look for certain triggers where the model starts to perform outside based off the same information provided. Is it coming to different decisions or biases based on your existing control set? Is a good way to at least flag where your model might start moving outwards or looking for hidden biases, I think is the key word.
yeah. And Dane, what role does data quality play in this whole effort of checking your AI and making sure that there isn't bias or sort of non-compliant issues creeping in?
Yeah, look, it's a broad topic, but I think that the fundamental exists in is if you have bad data coming in, you're going to have bad data going out, and that's outcome. It's nothing to do with AI. It's just as a fundamental, IT principle. You can only be as good as the data you inherently have. I think with AI, I think there's a larger move is the data structure now is less important, where you have these large models and concepts like data lakes, where it's not so important that the data is structured in as rigid sets of data as one needs, because now the market's moving towards inordinate quality sets of data that are inherently unstructured. A good example of that is X, for example, or Facebook. You have data sets that is just people randomly, sending out large quantities of words and text, which AI models are very, very good at taking that data, compressing it down into what it needs in order to determine the result. But the fundamental point, to go back to what you said, is if your data is wrong or it's tied to a wrong individual, the AI model won't be able to solve those problems for you. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it can add value, but your data is still a key aspect that it becomes good quality rather than bad.
So practically, if you look at this, then how do how do people go about actually testing this and checking what is happening? If you sitting in compliance in an insurance company and these things are going to come back to haunt you, you're not a tech guy, but you have to now interact on this with you have to analyze this risk. You have to actually explain this risk with your tech developers, etc. Where does the buck stop in that process? Who's the responsible person? The compliance guy? He doesn't know AI or stuff about bias and auditing AI, etc. Where's this going to land?
Yeah, a very good question, Tony. And look, it's a hard one to decipher. I think the net result is ultimately, you as the insurer or the broker, ultimately, if a decision's made, the ownership of that decision resides with the organization or yourself. And the best way to set you up for success in that is essentially three tenets. One, there must be traceability. So whatever tool or decision-making process you have is, can you trace that? Can you explain how and why a decision was made? Because then regardless of if it's the decision has changed or that, you can always look back and provide oversight about why that was done. The second is governance. So having defined roles and protocols for AI oversight. And what does that mean is, like you say, your compliance officer. I think there's a learning phase where that role may start to involve understanding within your platform how the AI models or that are being utilized in the organization, and can your tools provide that sort of oversight for you? It's not necessarily to understand why it was made, but knowing that it's an important thing to understand with and know that it exists. Because if you don't, if you ignore it, well, you're not going to have the tools available at the time and comes where you have to apply some sort of governance to that process. And then the third one is really just an intervention capacity. I think this is a key one. So, do you have the right protocols that humans within your whatever process AI has been implemented? Do you have the ability to challenge that decision? A human, can it challenge that decision? Can it override it? Could it suspend various decisions so that in the event that you start seeing deviations from your expected output, that a human can come in and overwrite and ultimately be the key decision maker on that. And another good example of that would be to have certain um, they call it sorry, I've lost my train of thought here, but essentially confidence metrics. So with each AI decision, you could associate to that what is the confidence level of this particular decision. So as a governance process, like you're only going to allow the AI to make decisions if it's 90% confident and above, for example. The outcome that it loses that confidence, then it triggers a override process or ability for a human to become involved to intervene, and then that becomes a feedback loop for the AI to say, look, in the event that it was not confident on this was the outcome of that decision. And it starts then to build the model towards your business model rather than to deviate outside of your intended use.
Mm-hmm. And this obviously is the role of the people building the AI into the software.
In some senses, yes. Look, I think there's two parties to the play. From our side as the platform and technology partner, I think our goal and our role is to provide the auditability of the tools coming in. So if a process is in there, do you have the right mechanisms to record decisions, to record the changes? And then that ultimately allows then the insurer, the owner of the data, who ultimately is responsible for the decision then to make ownership of their implementation of AI within their tool.
Mm. So I'm almost thinking that in the process of putting the system together and incorporation of the AI, etc., that you would have to have, because most companies would already have in their historical processes built-in ways of not having bias, because it has been a risk always to, as I said earlier on. So would you then see a discussion where those business rules, etc., is unpacked with the technology people, specifically with the goal of preventing bias and non-compliance through that?
Yeah, in some ways that becomes a feedback loop for your AI implementation. So as an organization, if you have a particular process or a structure when it comes to assessing claims, etc., those are inherently starters to how you would define or train your AI model to assess claims based on your requirements. So you have that input in terms of, I guess, organizational and historical ways of working that is fed within the model in order to drive your decision making elsewhere. In some cases, that might not be the case because a good use case for AI, in a sense, is it becomes very good at spotting particular patterns. So an organization may utilize AI to look for answers that you don't necessarily know the question existed or it asked. It's a very relevant one. So looking for patterns within claims payments that aren't immediately obvious but are very capable from an AI perspective to determine. You could say, look, something as fringing as we're getting X amount of claims from this particular area, and the only reason is it can correlate that to a random weather event outside the thing, which as an organization you may not even have considered. So you can use AI to spot patterns that aren't immediately apparent, but that becomes hard then to pre-train because you're essentially relying on the model to look outside and make its own judgment. There, the focus would be more about based on your decision, where have you come to this decision? Effectively, show your work.
Mm, mm. Yeah, so you would have to build something in where the AI reports to you when it sees that it's going outside the rules.
Yes, exactly that.
And comes back to you. Just from a for the product developers or underwriters on this, there seems to be a use case here for a product that could insure companies against AI bias. If that was to happen, how do you mitigate that risk with insurance? To try and cover the fallout. I think
Yeah,
that would be probably quite important.
yeah.
Wow, this very interesting conversation, and I think you could probably open up a big can of worms when you start digging into this. But I think at the end of the day, probably we've been doing this already in our companies. We've already put measures in place in call centers, in claims, client services, etc., to be able to manage these sort of things. It's now just a matter of making sure that those measures that we've put in our manual processes are incorporated into the development of the AI within our tech.
Yeah, exactly. And just looking into the comments from the audience now on the tail end, I think Kurt, you touch on a very good point, is data quality is everything. The object here is you can train your model, keep the right decisions and the right checkpoints in place that you understand why the decisions are made. But in the end of the day, your robust set of system data exists there to drive your process. It's not going to be a magic bullet that solves your organizational problems if your data is not ready or correct in the beginning.
Absolutely, a lot of food for thought. Dane, thank you so much. That was really fascinating. Really enjoyed having this discussion with you. And yeah, I'm sure we're going to unpack this topic a lot more in the future. So thank you very much for sharing with us and taking your time.
Thank you very much,
Yeah.
Tony. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah,
And I look
absolutely.
forward to hearing the rest of the conversations. I think it's a great lineup we have here today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. And thanks for your sponsorship. It's we really appreciate it.